developed a novel historiography that challenges the sources of information, such as official documentation, especially with reference to the partition. Women's unique experiences, encounters with violence, and their journey towards self actualization have been captured in their autobiographical writing centered on the partition. While we find an expansive repository of women's self representational writing with a spurt after 1971, we observe their invisibility in scholarly discursive practices. This paper will foreground the self inscriptional narratives of Bengali Muslim women in the post partition era, highlighting their emergent self with the formation of a nascent nation through their contribution to education and social or literary activism. Jobeda Khanam's Jiban Khatar Pataguli, published in Dhaka, offers a counter narrative to the assumptions about communal disharmony, women's access to education, employment opportunities, and their involvement in the 1947 partition. This account is an intricate web of memory and loss, of reminiscence and forgetting, of trauma and reconciliation, and of pain and empowerment. Post-colonial criticism, feminist historiography, and intersectionality will serve as the theoretical foundation of the paper. I now begin my paper. Feminist historiography endeavors to unearth women's writing that often counters veritable sources of information, particularly official records. Women's autobiographical writing in the post-partition era in India after 1947 and 1971 reveals an enriching repertoire unraveling a novel narrative of experiences centered on the two partitions. Urvashi Butalia, in her seminal work, The Other Side of Silence, discerns the fissures in the historiography on partition and interrogates, and I quote, "Why had historians not even attempted to explore what I saw, quote unquote, as the underside of this history, the feelings, the emotions, the pain and anguish, the trauma, the sense of loss, the silences in which it lay shrouded," unquote. Bagchi and Dasgupta in The Trauma and the Triumph, Gender and Partition in Eastern India state, and I quote, "Both memoirs and fiction together articulate the totality of experience by combining the creative and confessional modes of expression," unquote. Jobeda Khanam's autobiographical account, Jiban Khatar Pataguli, published posthumously, reflects her unique experiences of the two partitions, challenging the representation of women as victims on the plane of praxis and as non-participants in the nationalist discourse within post-colonial theorization. Her retelling encapsulates primarily the 1947 partition and also the one in 1971 that carried the remnants of the first. On the whole, when we revisit Indian history, we note the absence of information on Muslims in India since colonial times, as corroborated by Shumit Sarkar and Tonika Sarkar in the introduction to Women and Social Reform in Modern India. Bengal was a seat of great importance due to the Renaissance and the execution of modernizing principles by both the colonizer and the native reformers. The Bengali Bhadra Mohila, albeit a Hindu or Brahmo woman from a high caste, was the cynosure of enactment to the exclusion of women from other communities, classes, and castes. The comparatively progressive Hindu woman could access education often through the initiative of their modernized husbands. This homogenizing tendency has interpreted women's experience and agency in terms of a unitary, absolutist construction. The erasure of the Bengali Muslim woman in such a representation is fed by the imaginary that the mysterious Muslim woman in burqa, behind the purda, in a masculinized Islamic home, is tradition bound and unwelcoming of any reform. Thus, the Muslim woman was cast as the inferior other to her counterpart, the Hindu woman. The silencing that overcasts the presence of the Bengali Muslim woman in nationalist historiography has been foregrounded by Sonia Nishat Amin, Ghulam Murshid, and Meredith Bothweg. In Visible Histories, Disappearing Women, Mohua Sarkar points at the paucity of research on Bengali Muslim women's writings. In fact, there are these three categories: Bengali, Muslim, and women, which is a problematical collocation as it can unfold the complexities of culture, religion, and gender as intersectional coordinates. Even in later historiography, the invisibility of Bengali Muslim women persists. And I quote from Mohua Sarkar. She says, "The absence of Muslim women from the written history of 19th century Bengal is typically explained in terms of their apparent quote unquote traditionalism or backwardness. Indeed, from the survey of the extant historiography, one might get the impression that as far as the public life of late colonial Bengal was concerned, Muslim women almost did not exist." Unquote. It was towards the beginning of the 20th century that the visibility of the Bengali Muslim women in public life was strongly realized through their social activism, educational initiatives, and of course, literary activism. In fact, we are immediately reminded of Rokeya Sakhawat Hussain and the Sakhawat Memorial School, the fact that she was an ardent reformer and she worked tirelessly to bring about change in the lives of Muslim women. The difficulty of the Bengali Muslim women to express themselves in the published literature has been appositely summarized by Firdaus Azim. And I quote from Azim: "First, she, that is the Bengali Muslim woman, becomes the symbol of the backwardness of the community as a whole, and practices such as purda, or the wearing of the burqa, or keeping women away from vernacular and secular education are seen as part of this process. She also becomes a symbol of mystery, hiding behind the veil a potent sexuality, a mystery to be unearthed." Unquote. This overly simplified yet loaded construction has been questioned by Bengali Muslim women's personal narratives, especially within the macro narrative of partition. A proliferation of their writings after 1971 is starkly noticeable, yet there are some memoirs and autobiographies written even earlier that break the spell of silence and center the peripheralized voices of individual women. Incidentally, Shamita Basu expatiates, and I quote, "Having become objectified and ossified symbols of community honor, Muslim women were confined within the walls of patriarchal households and their voices silenced. They were frequently spoken of, but never allowed to speak about themselves." Unquote. However, some Muslim women accessed opportunities with the changing times and exerted their individuality. I would now like to exclusively focus on Bengali Muslim women's autobiographical writings and the partition, of course. Official documentation on the partition has communal discord as the locus of study, with women's bodies becoming the site of violence through rape, abuse, and abduction. In 1947, the division of Bengal was significantly different from that of Punjab. In Punjab, the migration of minority population was a bilateral phenomenon, and it transpired between 1947 and 1950, while the borders of Bengal has remained a porous continuum. It is in women's narratives that we can decipher myriad reasons other than communal disruption that motivated them to migrate to either side of dissected Bengal after 1971. Women's self representational discourse reflects their trajectory towards self determination, their agency, and move towards empowerment, caught as they were in the tumultuous times of partition. The revelatory writing of over 40 Bangladeshi women since the 1980s spans over a considerable length of time, almost 40 years. In fact, there are very eminent writers such as Panna Kaiser, Helen Kader, among others, who have written on this particular trope of the partition. The self referential narrativization of Farida Haq, Begum Mushtari Shafi, Jobeda Khanam, Jahanara Imam, and Nilima Ibrahim reveal facts about the partition that were hitherto undiscovered. Farida Haq's memoir, Journey Through 1971, My Story, published in 2008, has been instrumental in re-scripted historiography of the 1971 partition, as it is based on her first-hand experience in Pakistan as well as Bangladesh, harping on the intervention of the Indian government, army, and the Mukti Jodhas in the process of nation building. She unfolds that it was not only the eastern border that witnessed migration, but Bengali Muslims were also stranded in Pakistan, demystifying the historian's assumption. In fact, official records do not capture the reality of Bangladeshi families serving the Pakistani army who were held captive and could return home after an exchange pact for prisoners of war. Again, Begum Mushtari Shafi's Days of My Bleeding Heart, 2010, attests to a different truth about the relation between East and West Bengalis in Kolkata when she lived as a refugee in the city. And I quote from her: "In the train, bus, shops, markets, wherever we went, if others come to know we were from Bangladesh, they would show so much of respect and sympathy. We felt an intimate attachment with them since. Although the people speaking the same language were divided, resulting from division of a country, we have still remained as children begotten of the same mother, meeting after a long period of time." Unquote. Both these self-inscriptional narratives testify to the cultural syncretization between the Bengalis on either side of the border. Nilima Ibrahim, in her phenomenal work Ami Birangona Bolchi, 1998, has anthologized the memoirs of 7 war victims who have been endowed with the honor of Birangona, no less valiant than the martyrs in 1971. The voicing of the most traumatic experiences of these Bangladeshi women have initiated the process of healing and recovery that is innate to the act of narration. Nilima attempts to preserve the testimonies, the articulation of trauma by these women who are survivors of extreme violence such as rape and terror, aiding the restitution of honor and negotiation with pain. The act of telling is also an act of survival, of empowerment to express oneself before the interviewer, listeners, and the larger reading audience. Jahanara Imam, who is referred as the Shohid Janoni, mother of the martyr Rumi, lost not only her son but also her husband during the war. In her autobiography, Akattore Dinguli, 1986, she recollected, and I quote, "The entire city, that is, of course, the city of Dhaka here, is laughing and crying at the same time. People are happy because at last they are free, but the price that had to be paid in blood was immense." Unquote. In her writing, the private pain, familial memory, and national struggle intertwine to create a new historiography on women's sacrificial and heroic participation in the war. Now, I would like to particularly focus on Jobeda's personal account. Jobeda Khanam's memoir, Jiban, Khatar, Pataguli, did not receive serious attention for long, despite her reputation as a fictional writer of short stories and children's books. She writes from hindsight towards the terminal phase of her life, filtering her experiences of the grand narrative of the cataclysmic partitions. Ruminating on the socio-political upheavals and women's responses to them, Khatemanara Begum, who was one of her contemporaries, recalls, and I quote from her, "We, I mean people of my age group, have seen all three ages, past, present, and future. The first 23 or 24 years of our lives were under the mighty British colonizers. Our youth was spent in a lot of confusion and struggle under Pakistan, and our mature years passed in difficulty as independent citizens of Bangladesh." Unquote. Jobeda was born in Kushtia in erstwhile Bengal's Nodia district, that is now within Bangladesh, and was raised in opulence within a large family subscribing to stringent seclusion for women. While her grandfather was a religious head in the locality, her father was a modernized man who was fairly educated, and he worked in the education department. In fact, her father was sent to school and he also pursued further studies in college because he knew that Western education was the only way in which he could access a job in the British bureaucracy. Jobeda had the opportunity to travel on account of her father's job, but had been restricted to the home wherein she received preliminary education. In fact, when her father was posted at Bushirhat, his Muslim friends had advised him that Jobeda should be admitted to a Muslim school which practices purda. But he outrightly resisted because Jobeda was almost 11 years old then, and that was considered to be the marriageable age. So she only received rudimentary education in Bengali and mathematics at home. At 13, she was married to a much older man, but she completed her matriculation and pursued masters to later study in foreign universities in the 1950s. In fact, she did study in the University of London and University of Kentucky as early as the 1950s. Writing the memoir at age 70, Jobeda introspects on the workings of memory that defy any chronological progression of the narrative. She explains, and I quote, "The memories that come to my mind are just jotted down. That is why sometimes I write things that have happened later and sometimes things that have happened earlier. Many things I do not remember in sequence. Many things I remember very clearly, but I do not remember their dates and years." Unquote. Sorry, like the undulations and journeys of her own life, her writing too meanders through the lanes of time. The spontaneity in her writing is exemplified by the lack of chapter divisions and an inconclusive ending, possibly because of her death while scripting the account. The traumatic personal events in her life coalesce with macro narratives such as the Second World War, when Jobeda was widowed with two children at age 18 in 1939. In fact, her husband had a premature death because of typhoid. Her unceasing desire for learning inspired her to continue with academics while working as a teacher to fend for her children. Pitted against the times of the war, she accomplished her IA and BA degrees and landed in Calcutta in 1946 for the teacher training. Partition emerges as a trope in the narrative, intricately woven with her struggle for survival and self actualization through education after 1939. Her decision not to return to her natal family for shelter, yet her rootedness to her native place, sustains a tension that often characterize autobiographical writing from the borders. The following remapping and division of Nodia during the 1947 partition and the birth of a new nation, Bangladesh, later make a post colonial criticism of Jobeda's memoir possible. The repeated resurgence of partition as a temporal hallmark in the narrative threads events before and after. The chronicling of violence during the Bhasha Andolon in 1952 and later the 1971 Liberation War, resulting in the emergence of independent Bangladesh, depict Jobeda's memories of momentous events. Interestingly, Jobeda's micro-narrative unfurls against the macro-narrative of the nationalist agenda during partition, wherein she emphasizes on the communal integration that existed between Hindus and Muslims in Bengal. The communal polarization centered on the partition is self-abnegated with respect to her childhood experiences. The fond remembrance of the past evoked in the narrative is ruptured by the reality of the present. In fact, the intercommunal relationships are complicated under the impact of power structures in society. She explicates on how, quote unquote, the Muchalman, that is, the Muslim, could indulge in ritual pollution by touching the Hindus. In fact, there is this very interesting incident which Jobeda narrates. She talks about her visit to her friend's home, wherein this friend, who is called Lolita, she is a Hindu, and as she mentions about this concept of ritual pollution, she happens to touch the food in their house. And Lolita is brutally battered by her parents. But Jobeda is not chastised because her father, who was the inspector in the education department, obviously was at a far higher social stature than Lolita's father, who was just the headmaster of a school. She observes how the binary of self identified as Muslim and other as Hindu eventually diffuses the solidarity in opposing the British colonizer. The co-option of the individual within collectivities is noticeable as Indians were segregated on religious terms and the British were clubbed as a nation. She accords the communal disharmony not so much to the two-nation theory, but rather to the Hindu exclusionist tendencies. For instance, she was denied admission to the David Hare Training College in 1946 on account of her religious affiliation. In fact, it was not only the principal, who was a Hindu at the David Hare Training College, who did not want her to gain entry, but even the three Muslim professors did not support her. But later, she gained admission and reports how she was one among the minority group of Muslim students and that she had to cohabit in a Hindu majority area in Calcutta. As a rejoinder to a sarcastic comment of a fellow mate, Jobeda said, and I quote, "The day Pakistan is created, I will go there. Now Pakistan is mixed with India, so we have our own rights here." Unquote. Her journey towards autonomy is informed by challenges of the communal as well as the locational. She held strong political notions about the creation of a new nation, Pakistan, and assigned the Hindu claim for an undivided India to their aggrandizing policies and superiority over Muslims. I quote, "They behaved as if India was theirs, that is, the Hindus in this case. They would not let India be divided." Unquote. Hindu majoritarianism and their sole identification with the concept of the nation represents the Muslims as a disadvantaged community that must be dropped from the national whole. I now move to the concluding section of my paper. As a Bengali Muslim woman, Jobeda expresses her individuality by breaking the myth of victimhood imposed on Muslim women and undertaking what might otherwise be considered as transgressive acts. Her participatory role in camps, rehabilitating victims of the riots, and her donning of appurtenances borne by a married Hindu woman to facilitate her mobility even under life threatening circumstances, proves her fortitude. Historians such as Hoymunti Roy and Archit Basu Roy Chaudhuri underpin economic reasons for sustained cross border migrations more than communal conflagrations in the eastern frontier. In Jobeda's case, she assisted in the camps to earn for her own education, livelihood, and her children's well being. The years 1946 to 1947 reflect her arduous efforts to attain a job, and she posits how women could achieve their goals even during the exigent times of the partition. As an eyewitness, she portrays women's roles in the violent clashes wherein they furnished men with instruments to save the community's honor. In fact, she cites certain incidents where women would equip men with domestic items such as kitchen knives. In fact, she talks about this mother who wants to sacrifice the life of her own son in order to gain independence. The assumption of women as nonviolent victims during partition is punctured by Jobeda's anecdotal interjections. The strain of trauma and deep seated fear runs through the narrative, especially during the times after Direct Action Day, when she had to go into hiding with other Muslim women in a newspaper office, separated from her children. The sound of violence infiltrated their ears throughout the night, and women looked for poison when the Muslim leaders ascertained that their honor would remain unharmed. Probably her later experience of the 1971 partition, when Bengali women were ruthlessly violated by Pakistani soldiers, must have impacted her earlier memory and consolidated the impression of the days in 1946, when she herself was a pretty young woman. Jobeda sometimes encountered violence right before her eyes on the streets. At other times, she heard reports and rumors, to which she turned inwards to write through the trauma and violence. Her account is a rich interplay of pain and empowerment, of loss and accomplishment, of memory and forgetting within the larger act of cultural and national memorialization. That is the end of the paper. Thank you very much for your patient hearing.
Thank you very much, Dr. Saptaparna Roy. for your excellent lecture. Now we would like to start our Q&A session. If anyone has any question, I would like to request him or her to unmute yourself and ask this question directly to our honorable speaker. Any question or any observation? Any?
Yeah, may I?
Sure, ma'am.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Dr. Roy, for this brilliant paper, because I think your work has so intricately reflected the difference of women's autobiographies in the way they, disrupt, for example, the coherent, single, and unitary life of the author as projected in the, men's autobiography. So that came out so clearly. And also because Jobeda's narratives that you've been talking about have been so relational in some ways. And as you talk about pain and emotion and how it kind of also, talks about, you talk about how memories within the larger narratives of the family, community, and nation also kind of come up. I was just wondering, because your title has pain so clearly, I was wondering how would you look at the whole narrative of, the feminine pain, quote unquote, feminine pain vis-a-vis the masculine rationality in certain ways, And, how do you look at the whole discourse on pain? If you could, because I found that very interesting and it came out, but I was wondering if you could elaborate a bit more in terms of how pain is so important in terms of women's autobiographies. And yeah.
Absolutely, ma'am. Thank you so much for your observation and also the question. I think, the fact that the interest in women's personal narratives needs a very thorough relook at the current times is particularly because of this tension. And this tension is between the desire for enactment and empowerment at one hand, and the intense pain suffered by women during the times of partition. In fact, the fact that women had to witness mutilated bodies, sometimes their bodies was the site of enactment altogether, where they were raped, they were violated in a variety of ways. In fact, I am reminded of Tanveer's documentary. If you ever happen to watch that, I think it was a life-changing experience. Tanveer Mukammal's documentary on the partition, where he shows, there are these villages where there are no men. Women have lost their children, their husbands, their fathers during the partition, and the blotches of blood still remain on the mud baked walls. And they have to live with this trauma throughout their life. What we notice is most of these narratives were written almost, say, around 15 or 20 years later than the actual experience. Because this entire time was a time for them to reconcile, a time for them to negotiate with what they had gone through. And again, the other very important fact which I would like to highlight here is, though the trope of the partition is the same for all these women's, as I was highlighting that there are more than 40 narratives centered on this period, what we discern is that in each of these narratives, the strain of trauma and pain is different. For instance, when you are reading Ekattorer Dinguli, in that it is kind of a diary which encapsulates the diurnal, this diurnal negotiations of pain of a mother who has lost her son. I'm talking about Rumi in this case, of course. Shohit Janoni is what, she's referred to as. And how the regular experience of pain, the son is abducted, irrespective of the fact that the mother has to continue with her life, and she's documenting each day, each moment in her diary. She even loses her husband, who is on the lookout for the son. And at the end of the narrative, we see that, she wants to even send out her elder son to the war. So I think the phenomena of pain, as you have rightly pointed out, madam, comes out brilliantly in all of these narratives. Thank you for the question.
So any more question, please?
Yes, may I?
Yes, yes. Please go on.
So, Dr. Roy, thank you for this excellent discussion. While referring to the memory of the 46 riot, where she writes that they were collecting poisons and men were telling them that they will save the honor. And then you commented on that maybe this narrative is colored by or influenced by our experiences of the 70s when Muslim men violated Muslim women in Bangladesh. Why do we think this is a probable explanation rather than saying that she experienced the same thing in Calcutta during the Great Calcutta riot itself?
Thank you very much for that question, sir. The point which I was trying to emphasize over here is that, she writes this narrative when she is in her 70s. And it is possible that the experience, as you have rightly pointed out, of 1971 that consolidates, because, declarative memory, as we say, it tries to lend some sort of an order or control to the narrative. And somebody who has survived trauma in such a sustained manner, as in the case of Jobeda and other women, I think the experience of trauma once again, the reenactment, the repeated loops of reenactment that consolidated her former memories. That is the argument that I was trying to posit, rather than any strong difference between the two kinds of experience.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, any question or observation? Please feel free to ask or to share rather. Okay, I think there is no more question. So thank you very much once again, Dr. Roy, for your lecture. And let me now request Dr. Aparna Bandyopadhyay to deliver her speech. She will speak on the topic, Muslim women and fact-finding forays of the Indian state. So Dr. Aparna Bandyopadhyay, please.
Thank you very much. I heartily thank the organizers of this conference for giving me to be a part of this, the opportunity to critically engage with the plight and predicament of post-partition Bengali Muslim women and their struggles for rights. I'll be speaking on, as already mentioned, I'll be speaking on Muslim women and fact-finding forays of the Indian state. And this is a great event because I find that there are several collaborating institutions, and among them is the School of Women's Studies, Jadavpur University, my alma mater. So thank you all once again for giving me the opportunity to be a part of this very big event. And also thanks to Afroja, Dr. Afroja Khatun. She's a very close, I respect her a lot. She's very close to me. And primarily she had triggered my interest in this conference. I came to know of this conference because of her. So, and thanks to Nandita too, she's present today. Now, in my paper, I wish to examine the extent to which Muslim women in post-independence India have benefited from promises and guarantees enshrined in the Indian Constitution. My paper will foreground and assess the success of the various initiatives taken by the Indian state under different governments to address the problem of Muslim women's backwardness by epistemological, judicial, and legislative interventions. As we know that the journey of the independent Indian state generated widespread expectations among all sections of Indian citizens. People expected that the new nation would solve all the problems of its citizens, and the torchbearers of the new nation had promised to do so. Their promises, their transformative vision were enshrined in the Indian Constitution that came into effect, as we all know, on 26 January 1950. More than 7 decades have elapsed since India gained independence, and it is high time we asked ourselves the question, how far have these promises been fulfilled? How far has the vision of a new order of things been realized? In 1950, that is the year the Indian Constitution was put into effect, few were aware of the conditions of Muslim women and their status in Indian society. They lived behind the veil, at least they were perceived to be living behind the veil, and the reality of their cloistered existence within the Zen, not known to hidden from history. In South Asia, prior to the Arab invasions of Sindh in the 18th century, the chroniclers of the Sultanate and the Mughal regime, such as Ziauddin Barani, Amir Khusru, Ibn Battuta, Abul Fazl Faizi et al., did not care to write about her, that means the Muslim woman. She was invisible and her voice was muted. She was equally absent in the histories of medieval India written by British imperialist historians of the 19th century, such as James Mill, Eliot and Dawson, Vincent Smith, W.H. Moreland, and others. And also in the histories written by early Indian nationalist historians, such as Jodunath Sarkar, R.C. Mojumdar, et al. Only recently have historians started exploring the status of Muslim women in medieval India. Recent research reveals that the Muslim woman's existence was no better than that of a caged bird. Perpetually confined within the innards of the zenana, she was denied education and a modicum of health care. While lineage and marriage catapulted 1 or 2 women to political leadership and positions of influence, for example, Sultana Razia Nur Jahan and 1 or 2 others, the vast majority of Muslim women remained detached from happenings in the outer world. Traditional historical scholarship on colonial India maintained an undue reticence on women, on Muslim women. Muslim women, of course, they were doubly marginalized. They were marginalized by both patriarchy and community, and they were almost excluded from the annals of history. They were conspicuous by their absence in the historiography on the Renaissance, on social reform, and on the nationalist movement. Historians were not interested in researching and writing on Muslim women till a few decades back. The lack of information on Muslim women was sought to be compensated by imagination and weirdest myths and stereotypes were manufactured regarding them. They were perceived as ignorant, superstitious, repressed by religion and patriarchy, and were depicted as being in a perpetual state of bondage. Such perceptions continued to hold people's minds in thrall till a few decades back. Now, the introduction of the Indian Constitution and the ideal of equality embodied in Article 15 generated expectations that Muslim women, along with other categories of women, would automatically be elevated to an equal status in society. Their gender and religious affiliation would not would no longer impair their right to equality in emancipated India. Article 15 of the Indian Constitution, we all know that it states that the state shall not discriminate against any citizen on grounds of religion, race, caste, sex, place of birth, or any of them. This article further states, and other provisions of the Constitution further state that no citizen shall, on grounds only of religion, race, caste, sex, place of birth, or any of them, be subject to any disability, liability, restriction, or condition with regard to access to shops, public restaurants, hotels, and places of public entertainment, or the use of wells, tanks, bathing ghats, roads, and places of public resort maintained wholly or partly out of state funds or dedicated to the use of the general public. Nothing in the Constitution, it was further stated, shall prevent the state from making any special provision for women and children and for the advancement of any socially and educationally backward classes of citizens or for the scheduled castes and the scheduled tribes. Now, for nearly 2 decades since independence, policymakers, common citizens, and intellectuals believed that the constitutional guarantee had worked, that women in independent India were at par with men, that they had become automatically at par with men, that women of Islamic and other communities were on an equal footing with their counterparts in the majority community. Such expectations were proved false by the Towards Equality report of 1975 and the findings of several subsequent fact-finding initiatives. Muslim women became the object of a series of information-seeking missions, sometimes as a constituent of the category woman and at other times the category Muslim. In 2000-2001, Ritu Menon and Zoya Hassan conducted the Muslim Women's Survey. In 2005, the Sachar Committee conducted a study on Muslims on the basis of secondary sources. Though its focus was not exclusively on Muslim women, the report exposed the backwardness of Muslims in India and the abysmal conditions of Muslim women in particular. In 2013, another committee for the status of women in India was formed to investigate the status of women, including Muslim women, and this is the latest government-initiated All India study of the conditions of women in general and Muslim women in particular. Now, let us more elaborately discuss the Towards Equality, the findings embodied in the Towards Equality report 1975. Okay. Now, the publication of this report was a turning point in many respects. Now, the spurt of radical feminism in the 1960s had goaded the United Nations organization to address the issue of gender inequality. India was directed to probe the status of women in society, and this led to the constitution of a committee for the status of women in India in 1971, which, after several years of fact-finding, presented the Towards Equality report on 1st January 1975, the day that marked the beginning of the UN Decade for Women. This report shook the elite intelligentsia out of their complacency with its shocking revelation that the condition of Indian women had changed little since independence. The committee concluded that there was an increase in the, there was in fact an increase in the marginalization of women in Indian economy and society. The report Towards Equality found demographic trends of declining sex ratio, disparities in the life expectancy and death rates between men and women, and the difficulties involved in women's access to literacy, education, and livelihood. The makers of the report were of the view that the Indian state had failed in its constitutional responsibility of gender equality. The Indian nation has failed its women, they concluded. The committee conducted a separate survey on the status of women in a minority community. The report of the survey was prepared by Srimati Shahida Latif, member of the task force. The report especially focused on women in the Muslim community and was incorporated in Appendix 2 of the Towards Equality. Were chosen for the survey. These were chosen for the size of the Muslim population and also for the regional character. The people doing the survey had intended to cover both urban and rural areas, but since the response from the rural areas was poor, the survey was limited to urban areas only. The analysis was based on the responses of a total of 1,577 filled-in questionnaires. The survey revealed that a high proportion of respondents in the 9 states had no formal education. In some families, girls were taught a little Urdu and the Quran at home. The majority of the respondents did not know any written language. They could not write in any language. Most of the respondents did not distinguish between the education of their sons and daughters. Did not discriminate against their daughters, that is. Most of the families sent both sons and daughters to government schools, and an equal emphasis was placed on their education. Most respondents in these 9 states were not aware of their rights as specified in the Sharia with regard to inheritance, polygamy, maintenance, divorce, custody of children, and unilateral divorces. A number of respondents did mention a course in order to get their rights, but they would still rely on their family for her rights. Not considered a major problem. The observance of Porda ranged from 67% in Jammu and Kashmir to 15.8% in Gujarat. It was confined mostly to housewives in the slum areas and in the middle class areas. Once the Muslim woman became educated or started working, in most cases, she left the parda. The Muslim woman was still far removed from the community outside the home. The participation of Muslim women in community life and their contribution to social welfare schemes was negligible and was confined to mainly career women, students, and housewives of the middle classes. Most respondents did not have any idea about their rights in the Constitution. Most respondents had exercised their right to vote in the last election. Most of them did not read newspapers, but they did listen to the radio from time to time. Most of them noted an improvement in their standard of living in the past years. Neither parda nor equal rights with men was considered important. The emphasis was on education and job opportunities. The primary effort was towards better employment opportunities and economic uplift of the community. The position of Muslim women, the report concluded, was not altogether negative compared to that of their Hindu counterparts. The Towards Equality report and its revelations at one plane sparked off the feminist intervention in history, leading to a spurt of feminist historical scholarship on Muslim women and also other categories of women. Feminist historical scholarship using the intersectional lens. At another level, the Towards Equality report puts some pressure on the government to address the problems of Muslim women through their different policies and programs. The report hammered in the realization that mere constitutional guarantees were not enough. It was necessary to follow constitutional guarantees with actions and initiatives on a regular basis, and for that, awareness of actual conditions was necessary. Now, let's move on to the Muslim Women's Survey of 2001. In 2001, Zoya Hassan and Ritu Menon conducted the Muslim Women's Survey in 12 states spread over 40 districts in India. Though this survey was not a government initiative, it is pertinent to briefly discuss the findings of this survey because this is the first comprehensive nationwide baseline survey of Muslim women in India. Hassan and Menon surveyed 9,541 Muslim and Hindu women respondents, 80% Muslim and 20% Hindu. 60% are nearly 60% enrollment rate for Muslim women was 40.66%. Less than 17% of the Muslim women enrolled in schools completed 8 years of schooling. Less than 10% completed higher secondary schooling, which was below the national average. Of the women who completed their studies, 26% felt that they had to overcome obstacles in order to continue their education. Various kinds of obstacles to continue with their education. On the whole, a slightly higher proportion of Muslim women than Hindu women reported that they had faced obstacles in their schooling. A general devaluation of education was also linked to the desirability of early marriage, as indicated by the mean age of first marriage, which was as low as 15.6. In the rural north, this age dipped even further to 15 years. Early marriage was cited as an important reason for dropping out of school. The average rate of participation for Muslim women in the workforce, the Muslim Women Survey revealed, was 14%, which in itself was lower than the rate of participation for Hindus, which was 18%, and significantly lower than that of the scheduled caste, which was 37%, and OBC, which was 22%. The vast majority of women surveyed across zones, irrespective of education levels, claim to be unaware of any programs directed towards women. The advantages of most government schemes, which over the years had specifically targeted women, had generally not accrued to them. Lack of information was an important reason why most welfare provisions passed Muslim women by. Most did not know of the existence of schemes for special loans and grants to widows or of credit facilities. According to the survey, 88% of Indian women were currently married. There were slightly more Muslim women, 86%, than upper caste Hindus, which is 84%. 60% of Muslims were married by a woman's educational level did not seem to have any impact on her decision making, either for better or for the worse. A woman's decision-making powers had a negative correlation with a rise in economic status. The higher the status, the lower a woman's decision-making power. Excuse me. A very high, that is 70% of women, Hindu and Muslim, all India, across classes, reported that they needed permission to go to work. A staggering 86% said that they needed permission from their husbands for all activities. Unmarried girls sought permission from their fathers, and married women from their husbands and in-laws. Older women might even need permission from their sons for certain activities. Community differences were negligible, although a greater percentage of Muslim women than Hindu women reported needing permission to work. The Muslim Women Survey reported that approximately 20% of respondents experienced verbal and physical abuse in the marital home. Over 80% of this was at the hands of their husbands. The figures for Muslims and Hindus were strikingly similar, both in the National Family Health Survey and the Muslim Women Survey, although the Muslim Women Survey showed that Hindu women experienced greater levels of violence than did Muslim women in all 4 zones. The figure for Muslim women reporting abuse stood at 18%, backward caste at 24%, and caste Hindus at 10%. The report revealed that Muslim women in India were disadvantaged thrice over as members of a minority community, as women, and as poor women. Gender discrimination coalesced with class inequalities to perpetuate their structured disempowerment. The findings of the survey, however, demonstrated that cultural restrictions were not responsible for low education. Religion did not influence the status of women, even though there were community-specific disadvantages that arose out of poverty. The status of Muslim women were determined by social and economic class, urban or rural. On the whole, the Muslim Women Survey presented a picture of glamic and political that constantly defined and circumscribed women's lives, all women's lives, and of those of Muslim women in particular. Now, the next committee report that I'll discuss is that of the Sachar Committee, published in 2005. In March 2005, former then Prime Minister Manmohan Singh constituted a 7-member high-level committee headed by former Chief Justice of Delhi High Court, Rajinder Sachar, to study the social, economic, and educational condition of Muslims in India. The committee submitted its report in 2006, and the report was available in the public domain in November 30, 2006. The 403-page report had suggestions and solutions for the inclusive development of Muslims in India. The report highlighted issues facing the Muslim community and their representation in Indian public life. The report was the first of its kind to reveal the backwardness, in quotes, a term used in Indian academic and legal discourse for historically dispossessed or economically vulnerable communities. And of course, this is not meant to be pejorative. Reveal the backwardness of Indian Muslims. Okay. An issue highlighted was that while Muslims constituted 14% of the Indian population, they only comprised 2.5% of the Indian bureaucracy. The Sachar Committee concluded that the conditions facing Indian Muslims was worse than that of scheduled castes and scheduled tribes. Regarding Muslim women, the Sachar report observed that despite the differences within their lot, when compared to women from other faiths in India, the majority of Muslim women are among the most disadvantaged. I've quoted from the report. Least literate, most economically impoverished, and politically marginalized sections of Indian society. While debates on personal law and divorce are pertinent and timely, and one is not for a minute running down these issues, Muslim women need to be seen as social beings too, entitled to the same rights that the Constitution of India grants to all its citizens. This is straight from the report. The right to education, especially at the primary level, is mandated by the Constitution, yet over 60 independence, less than 50% of Muslim women in India are from other minorities, 76%, 62%, and a whopping 90% among Jain women. The Sachar Committee report does expose the backwardness of Muslim women, Muslims in general, and Muslim women in particular, and brought the issue to national attention, sparking a discussion that is still ongoing. The committee recommended setting up an Equal Opportunity Commission to provide a legal mechanism to address discrimination complaints, including in matters such as housing. Now, next I move on to discuss the report of the High-Level Committee on the Status of Women in India that was published in 2013. In May 2000, the Ministry of Women and Child Development, the governors constituted by the President of India, established a high-level committee on the status of women in India. The 2013 committee's goal was to undertake a comprehensive study on the status of women since 1989 and to suggest appropriate policies based on an assessment of women's economic, legal, political, educational, health, and socio-cultural needs. The report revealed that Muslim women lag behind in almost all key socio-economic indicators of development. They are economically and educationally marginalized. They have low social status, and they experience domestic as well as communal violence spurred by identity politics. They rank lowest in terms of labor force participation rate. Health services rarely reach them due to lack of existing schemes and partly due to the limited mobility on account of ghettoization as a result of riots and communal violence. They suffer on account of practices such as triple talaq, polygamy, customs, and other customs. Now, these fact-finding forays into the lived reality of Indian Muslim women evidently stem from a tacit acknowledgement that knowledge is necessary for the government to formulate policies for the betterment of Muslim women, and thus recuperate the validity of Article 15, which is defied and violated in everyday practice. These epistemological initiatives manifest an apparently honest desire on the part of the government to come face to face with the baseline realities before remedial action is taken or urged. However, if the revelations of these fact-finding forays have been effective in ensuring equality, then renewed effort at fact-finding would not have been necessary. This repetitive endeavor, while emphasizing and acknowledging the necessity of knowledge prior to action, also manifests the failure of the state to concretely change the lives of women and realize the constitutional goal of equality. The revelations of these investigative schemes have failed to make a dent in the living realities of Muslim women's existence. Even after days of the more than 7 decades of the birth of modern Indian democracy, separate reports based on religious and other social identities need to be produced, points towards major flaws in our democracy. Undeniably, Muslim women continues to be considered unequal citizens. Okay. Now, let me briefly touch the Uniform Civil Code, because the Uniform Civil Code again was promised by, I mean, it was set as a goal by the Indian Constitution. It was incorporated in the directive principles of the Indian Constitution. But I mean, this has not been put into practice, as we know. It remains an unfulfilled aspiration. And also, this was one of the major issues in the agenda of the women's autonomous women's movement. But the UCC, as we know, remains elusive till date. But again, there are sections of women feminists, and including Muslim feminists, who don't really welcome the civil. They think that this will lead to further marginalization of the Muslims. So this remains a debatable issue, but yes, but the constitutional promise remains unrealized. That's the point that I'm trying to emphasize. And on the whole, what I find is that that the manner in which the Indian state has been handling the Muslim women's question since independence is fraught with compromises and ambivalence. The state wants to acquire knowledge about Muslim women, but knowledge does not necessarily lead to effective action. It makes big promises, it makes recommendations, suggestions, but none of these are really put into practice. And hence Muslim women continue to lag behind men of their own community and women of the majority community. And also there is also the calculation, the vote bank factors, the vote bank, and so women's well-being remains so deeply entrenched in electoral politics and communal rhetoric that the constitutional promise of equality is likely to remain a chimera, at least for quite some time. Thank you. That's the end of my paper. Thank you for your patience, for your time. Okay. And let me also add that this is my first attempt to explore the world of Muslim women, and I've done it very naively. I should admit, and so I don't think I'll be able to handle your questions well. But then again, I look forward to your comments and observations.
Thank you very much, madam. Thank you. Thank you very much for your excellent lecture. Now, this is a question and answer session. So please feel free to ask question or share your observation with our honorable speaker.
May I ask a question, please?
Yes, yes, sure, madam.
Aparna, first of all, thank you. That was a brilliant paper. And moreover, it's wonderful meeting you over this online platform.
Yes. It's really wonderful.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. We haven't met for a very long time. At least this is the opportunity where we could again see each other. I just wanted to know that in the 1975 report that you spoke of, there was a point which you made that the access to education, women's access to education, was not informed by their religious affiliation.
Yes.
Over there, did you find a difference between the percentage of women, Hindu women who could be educated or were educated, and the percentage of Muslim women? Was there any difference during the 19th?
But I think the Muslim Women's Survey report said that there was no difference with regard to access to education. Yes, actually, I've become confused myself. But I think this is the observation of the Muslim Women's Survey, that religion does not really make a difference. It's class which makes a difference. And the women across communities face obstacles in their journey towards educational empowerment. Poor women of Hindu communities, poor women of Muslim communities, they equally face these obstacles, and they have to struggle a lot to overcome these obstacles. I think that is the observation made by the Muslim Women's Survey report. And with regard to the towards equality report, yes. Yes, the Towards Equality report concluded that the position of Muslim women was not altogether negative compared to their Hindu counterparts. Yes, yes, right. So actually, the idea of backwardness, I mean, the idea that was emphasized by the Sachar committee, that Muslims were backward within quotes, that they were lagging behind in all with regard to the various indicators of development, was, I think, was first flagged by the Sachar committee. And the previous reports did not really find any major difference with regard to access to education or employment. I mean, they found that, all communities, women of all communities face these difficulties, and the difficulties were not specific to the Muslim community alone. So I think, yes, you rightly observed that there is a change in the way that the condition of Muslims and the status of by the state and these various factors.
Yeah, may I?
Yes,
Yes,
ma'am.
of course, Nandita.
Yeah, thank you, Aparna, so much. I think your paper really was very insightful in terms of, especially because you brought or you connected the epistemological, judicial, and the legislative. And thank you so much for bringing up the epistemological, because it's so interesting that you cite the Towards Equality 1975 report and you end in May 2013, because we don't really know what's going to happen if more research is done in the present era. But I don't want to go into that. That's a separate question. What really excited me is, and thank you so much for actually bringing up the Towards Equality report and the question by Dr. Roy as well, because I remember I was reminded of what Beena Majumdar, who was the chairperson of the committee, when she mentioned and she became critical about how she being a professor of a university, she became critical of a college. She became critical about how we are forgetting our own privileged locations within higher education spaces, and she questioned about how our training in academia has made us complacent in rendering invisible the process of marginalization of larger majority of women. So she was also wanting to question our own complacency, because as middle class privileged women, how we are being able to satisfactorily balance between, because we are being able to satisfactorily balance between our family and work, so we feel as if everything, all women in India are fine. So I think that actually gives me this whole, we as feminists have been harping on the whole issue of reflexivity, on self-criticality. I think this report for the first time actually, and Beena Majumdar calls herself as a political scientist who turned feminist, while doing this research. So it becomes so important because this report, and I thank you so much. That is the reason I also thank you, because this report actually in the first, time, for the first time, was very self-critical, even as subjects, as women, as people who are wanting to produce knowledge, generate knowledge on women, and they were being for the first time self-critical, and reflexive. So I thank you so much for that. And also, I think the way you ended in terms of, unequal citizenship and democracy, given what is happening since 2014, we don't really know whether these reports at all would be, how they would be generated and what would further implementation courses be. And anyway, so the two papers actually did talk about so much in terms of gender and intersectionality also, which I think the Towards Equality report was again very important in terms of it. So thank you so much. So even if I hope you make more such naive efforts, quote unquote naive efforts in the future as well.
Absolutely. I second what ma'am has said.
Thank you. I'll try, definitely. And Saptaparna, I really liked your paper on Jobeda Khanam. I think there'll be a recorded version too available on YouTube. So I want to listen to your paper once again. Wonderful.
Thank you so much, Aparna.
I think it is, this show is running on YouTube right now.
Oh, okay. So that's great. That's wonderful.
Yes.
And there's another survey conducted by, I think is the Protichi Foundation. It's called the SNAP Living Reality Survey, and its focus is on Muslim women in, not just women, but Muslims in Bengal. And I did not have time to discuss the report, and I also do not have the report in my hands because I'm currently at Delhi. I could not return to my hometown on the day I was supposed to, and so I don't have the report. And I've given if I get another opportunity, of course I'll discuss that report too. And there's also a small survey conducted by the Center for Studies in Social Sciences. I think that survey was in 2007 or something. It was conducted on several minority concentration districts in West Bengal. Among them was South 24 Parganas, and also Murshidabad was also there. So there are several initiatives by organizations, private organizations, academic institutions, also which could be taken into account, because all these institutions, they are part of this entire, knowledge creating enterprise. The state is creating knowledge at one level, and the non-governmental institutions and organizations are also trying their own ways to create knowledge among Muslim women, and supposedly to influence the government, to create pressure on the government to do something to address these problems. But what is coming out of all these fact-finding and knowledge-creating endeavors? That is the question that I was trying to pose to you all. Of course, I don't have an answer to the question. অনেক কিছুই তো বলা হচ্ছে, লেখা হচ্ছে, কাজের কাজ কি হচ্ছে সেটাই হচ্ছে বড় কথা।
Okay. Any more questions?
Thank you. And thank you, Nandita, for your comments and observations. Great. Saptaparna and Nandita. Afrojadi?
You have a question.
একটা কোশ্চেন করতে চাইছি যে
হ্যাঁ।
ইউসিসি নিয়ে এখন বিভিন্ন বক্তব্য উঠে আসছে। আমার প্রশ্ন যে ইউসিসি সাপোর্ট করছে ঠিক কোন রাজনৈতিক দল অথবা অ্যাক্টিভিস্টরা, এবং কত পার্সেন্ট বা কারা সাপোর্ট করছে না, সেই পরিসংখ্যান কি কিছু আছে? যদি অপর্ণা একটু বলো।
না, এটা তো যদি আপনি ভালো উত্তর দিতে পারবেন। তবে অবশ্যই আপনার বক্তব্য এই বিষয়ে শুনেছি এবং সেটা আমি সমর্থনও করি, এবং আমার তো মনে হয় খুব ন্যায়সঙ্গত ভাবেই আপনি এবং আপনার সঙ্গে আরো অনেকেই ইউনিফর্ম সিভিল কোডের বিরোধিতা করছেন। এটা প্রিন্সিপাল হিসেবে খুবই ভালো, কিন্তু যখন কোন একটা বিশেষ রাজনৈতিক দল বিশেষ কোন রাজনৈতিক উদ্দেশ্য পূরণ করার জন্য, খুবই সংকীর্ণ কোনো উদ্দেশ্য পূরণ করার জন্য ইউনিফর্ম সিভিল কোড কে বাস্তবায়িত করার চেষ্টা করেন, তখন সেটা একটা আশঙ্কা তো আমাদের সবার মধ্যে জাগবেই যে মাইনরিটি কমিউনিটি গুলো আরো মার্জিনালাইজড হয়ে যাবে, মানে আরো প্রান্তিকীকরণের এবং বিশেষত মেয়েদের প্রান্তিকীকরণ আরো মানে একটা সাংঘাতিক পর্যায়ে চলে যাবে। হ্যাঁ, তো এটা অ্যাকচুয়ালি প্রান্তিকীকরণেরই একটা হাতিয়ার হয়ে উঠবে। তো নিঃসন্দেহে এই আশঙ্কা আমার মধ্যেও আছে এবং খুব ন্যায়সঙ্গতভাবে যথার্থভাবেই আপনাদের এবং আরো অনেকের মধ্যেই আছে। সুতরাং কনস্টিটিউশন একটা এক ধরনের ভাবনা নিয়ে ইউনিফর্ম সিভিল কোডের কথা বলেছিল, কিন্তু যারা সেটা বাস্তবে একটা মানে বাস্তব চেহারা দেবে, যেটা বাস্তবায়িত করবে, মানে তাদের সংকীর্ণ চিন্তা ভাবনা। তো এই কারণে অবশ্যই মানে অনেক কথা বলা করার জন্য।
আমি কি এটাতে জাস্ট একটু অ্যাড করতে পারি?
হ্যাঁ 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 হ্যাঁ
হ্যাঁ, সেটা হচ্ছে যে আফরোজাদি মানে প্রশ্ন তুললেন এবং অপর্ণাও যেটা বললো, আমাদের তো এটা সত্যি নারীবাদীদের এটা নিয়ে বা উইমেন্স মুভমেন্টের এটা নিয়ে তো অনেক দিন ধরে একটা আলোচনাও চলছে, মানে স্পেশালি 1980-90 দশকের পর থেকে যখন রিলিজিয়াস ফান্ডামেন্টালিজমের রূপটা অন্য একটা জায়গায় এসে গেল, তখন মানে ওই সময় অবধি কিন্তু নারীবাদীরাও একজোট ভাবে মানে একসাথে ইউনিফর্ম সিভিল কোডটাকে সাপোর্ট করছিলেন। যদিও তাদের মধ্যে অনেক রকম পার্থক্য ছিল যে ইউনিফর্ম সিভিল কোডটা কিভাবে করা উচিত, কেন তাদের মনে হয়েছিল যে মহিলাদের অধিকার যেহেতু প্রত্যেকটা রিলিজনই খর্ব করে, সেজন্য ক্রস রিলিজনস একটা কোড হওয়া উচিত যেটা জেন্ডার জাস্টিসের জন্য আসা উচিত। কিন্তু যখন আস্তে আস্তে দেখা গেল যে ভারতীয় জনতা পার্টি মানে হিন্দু রাইটও ভীষণভাবে ইউনিফর্ম সিভিল কোড চাইছে, কিন্তু সেটা নট মোর ইন টার্মস অফ ক্রস রিলিজন, সেটা মোর ইন টার্মস অফ ইউনিটি অফ দ্য নেশন কাইন্ড অফ, এবং সেটা তো ভীষণ একটা মারাত্মক জায়গা, যেটা বোধহয় এখন অপর্ণা বলছেন বা আফরোজাদি যেখান থেকে বলছেন। ওই সময় কিন্তু ইন মেনি ওয়েজ অনেকেই ইউনিফর্ম সিভিল কোডকে সাপোর্ট করেছিল, কিন্তু অ্যাক্রস আফটার 1990s এবং তার পরের সময়টা এসেই কিন্তু নারীবাদীরা তো ভীষণভাবেই তার থেকে সরে এলো যে ইউনিফর্ম সিভিল কোড হওয়ার কোনো মানেই হয় না। আর এখন দিনে তো ফ্লেভিয়া অ্যাগনেসের মতন লোকজন তো ভীষণভাবেই বিরোধিতা করছে, নিবেদিতা মেনন মানে সবাই বিরোধিতা করছেন যে কোথাও না কোথাও এই যে পুরো ট্রিপল তালাকের ব্যাপারটা হয়ে যাচ্ছে, পুরো বুরখা ইস্যুটা হয়ে যাচ্ছে, কোথাও না কোথাও যেন এরকম হয়ে যাচ্ছে না দ্যাট হিন্দু মেন উইল হ্যাভ টু সেভ দ্য মুসলিম উইমেন ফ্রম মুসলিম মেন। মানে এই যে পুরো একটা মাল্টিপল রিলিজিয়াস পেট্রিয়ার্কিজ এর গল্পটা চলে আসছে, যেখানে সারাক্ষণই কমিউনিটির ভেতরে মুসলমান পুরুষ যে ভীষণভাবেই তার সেখানে মহিলাদেরকে দমন করে, এবং অন্যদিকে হিন্দু পুরুষ যেটা হিন্দু মহিলাদেরকে ভীষণ এম্পাওয়ার করছে, যেটা অপর্ণার পেপারে পুরো পরিষ্কার বেরিয়ে এলো, যেটা সেটা আদৌ হচ্ছে না, কোনোদিনই হয় না। কিন্তু এই যে দুটো রিলিজিয়াস কমিউনিটিজ এর পেট্রিয়ার্কাল কম্পিটিশন, আর আদার আমাদের মতো মেজরিটেরিয়ান যেখানে আজকে গভর্নমেন্ট আছে, সেখানে একটা মাইনরিটি কমিউনিটিকে পুরোপুরি মানে ডিসেম্পার করে দেবার যে সাধন হয়ে উঠবে না, এটা নিয়েই তো সবার মধ্যে বোধহয়, যেটা অপর্ণাও বলছিল, যেটা আমার মনে হয় আফরোজাদির মানে আমার অন্তত সেটা মনে হয় যে আমি যে লেখাপড়াগুলো করছি সেখানে অন্তত এই জায়গাটা বারবার করে উঠে এসছে যে প্রথম থেকেই তাদের ওই ইউনিটি অফ দ্য নেশন রিজার্ভি জেন্ডার জাস্টিস এই লড়াইটা চলছিলই, কিন্তু এই সময় এসে দাঁড়িয়ে আমাদের ইউনিফর্ম সিভিল কোডটাকে অ্যাসপিরেশন হিসেবে আদৌ দেখবো কিনা, বা আমি তো মনে করি একেবারেই দেখার কোনো মানে হয় না, বিকজ আমার মনে হয় বুরখা ডিবেটটা ইটসেলফ ইজ শোয়িং আস যে কোন দিকে এই সরকার নিয়ে যেতে চাইছে। সো মানে পুরো একটা হিন্দু ইউনিফর্ম সিভিল কোডের মধ্যে ওই ইউনিফর্মিটির প্রিটেন্সে অ্যাকচুয়ালি হিন্দু কমিউনিটিকেই একটা সুপিরিয়র জায়গা নিয়ে যাওয়ার একটা চেষ্টা, সেই ভয়টা আমার মনে হয় আমাদের সবার মধ্যেই হয়তো। সেই জন্য এখানে আমি জানি না, অবশ্য আমি যেটা দেখেছি বাংলাদেশে আবার অন্যরকম ভাবে ব্যাপারটা আসে, সো ইট মাইট বি আ ভেরি গুড আইডিয়া টু ইভেন কম্পেয়ার যে ইউনিফর্ম সিভিল কোডটা ক্রস দিস টু কান্ট্রিজ কিভাবে ডিসকোর্সটা আসছে। সরি আমি একটু বেশি সময় নিয়ে নিলাম।
না খুব পার্টিনেন্ট কথা বলেছেন।
বেশি ডিবেট হচ্ছে এটা নিয়ে, এবং প্রচুর প্রশ্নের মুখে পড়তে হচ্ছে, আমরা কি তাহলে রক্ষণশীল কেন চাইছি না, এই জায়গাটা ক্লিয়ার করা দরকার। ধন্যবাদ অপর্ণা এবং নন্দিতাদি, খুব ভালো হলো। পরে আবার নিশ্চয়ই আমরা এই নিয়ে
নিশ্চয়ই ইউনিফর্ম সিভিল কোড নিয়েই একটা আলাদা আলোচনা হতে পারে, হওয়া জরুরি হয়ে
গেছে, একদমই তৈরি হয়ে গেছে।
একদমই একদমই।
এবং যেইভাবে এগোচ্ছে ব্যাপারটা, এখন তো একটা বোধহয় কর্ণাটক না কোন স্টেট অলরেডি বলে দিয়েছে ইউনিফর্ম সিভিল কোড তারা আনতে চলেছে, সো ইটস অলসো দ্যাট ওয়ে ভেরি ইম্পর্টেন্ট।
Okay, we still do have some time. You can please share your observation, or you can still ask your question if you have any. No problem. We're very much within the stipulated time. Okay, I think we don't.
Actually, আমি সপ্তপর্ণাকে একটা প্রশ্ন করি। সপ্তপর্ণা, তুমি কি ওই ভদ্রমহিলার পড়েছো একদিন সাম গোল্ডেন কাস্কেট বা ওরকম বাস্কেট ওরকম একটা কিছু রাফ, এনিওয়ে মানে an ex-Brebonite, I don't remember her name, কিন্তু তার একটা মেমোয়ার তার নাতনি প্রকাশ করেছিল, আমি জাস্ট ফরগট। তুমি কি পড়েছো? মানে আর কোন কোন মুসলিম মেয়েদের মেমোয়ার তুমি পড়েছো সপ্তপর্ণা?
পার্টিশন রিলেটেড অপর্ণাদি?
না, এই পার্টিশন, মুক্তিযুদ্ধ বা এমনি মানে মেয়েদের, মুসলিম মেয়েদের স্মৃতিকথা,
দয়াময়ীর কথা,
আর কি পড়েছো?
সুনন্দা শিকদারের
না মুসলিম, হ্যাঁ না, কিন্তু মুসলিম মেয়েদের নিজের লেখা,
মুসলিম মেয়েদের নিয়ে পার্টিকুলারলি লেখা।
হ্যাঁ,
আমি বেগম মুশতারি শাফি, তারপরে ফরিদা হক, জাহানারা ইমাম, নীলিনা ইব্রাহিম, এনারা তো আছেনই। এছাড়াও প্রধানত যেটা আমরা দেখছি সেটা হচ্ছে গিয়ে রাসসুন্দরী দেবীর সময় থেকে, হ্যাঁ, প্রধানত হিন্দু মহিলাদেরই লেখা আমরা পাচ্ছি। কিন্তু এই পার্টিশনের সময় পার্টিকুলারলি 1971 ঘিরে অনেকেই আছেন যারা তাদের মেমোয়ার্স লিখেছেন। যেরকম তাদের মধ্যে কিছু নাম আছে, ধরুন রাবেয়া খাতুন, তারপরে হেলেন কাদের লিখেছেন, পান্না কাইজারের লেখা রয়েছে, তারপরে হোসনা আরা আজাদ, এরকম অনেকেই আছেন যারা লিখেছেন, কিন্তু তারা একটু পরের দিকে আর কি, 1980s এর পর থেকে আমরা পাচ্ছি সেই লেখাগুলো। আর খুবই ইন্টারেস্টিং, কারণ এই প্রত্যেকটা মেমোয়ার যদিও পার্টিশনের ট্রোপটাকে ব্যাকড্রপ হিসাবে রেখে লেখা, তবুও ন্যারেটিভস গুলো একেবারেই এক্সক্লুসিভ, কারণ প্রত্যেকের হারানো, প্রত্যেকের ক্ষত, সেগুলো ভীষণভাবে আলাদা। তো এটা একটা মারাত্মক, ইটস এ ভেরি রিচ রিপোজিটরি, মানে প্রচুর ন্যারেটিভস রয়েছে, যে কোনো পড়া দরকার, সেগুলো নিয়ে লেখা, পড়াশোনা করা, রিসার্চ, এগুলোর প্রয়োজন রয়েছে।
আচ্ছা, আর এই পার্টিশন নিয়ে হিন্দু মেয়েদের যে আত্মকথন, তার সঙ্গে কি কোন একটা তুলনামূলক আলোচনার জায়গায় মানে যাওয়া কি যায়, মানে বা মানে ওই এক্সারসাইজটা করার কি কোনো মানে হয়? মানে আমি এমনি জিজ্ঞেস করছি যে এদের পার্টিশনকে দেখার দৃষ্টির মধ্যে কি কোনো পার্থক্য দেখতে পাচ্ছ?
হ্যাঁ, ডেফিনেটলি একটা তফাৎ তো থাকবেই। হ্যাঁ, তার কারণ হচ্ছে যে যেই সব জায়গাতে ওই যে বললাম হিন্দু মেজরিটেরিয়ানিজম রয়েছে, যেরকম আমরা জোবেদার ক্ষেত্রেই লক্ষ্য করছি, কলকাতাতে বালিগঞ্জের মতো একটা জায়গাতে যখন ও হাঙ্গারফোর্ড স্ট্রিটেও থাকছে, তো সেই সময়ও বারবার করে বলছে যে কিভাবে একটা মার্জিনালাইজেশন কাজ করছিল। তো সেক্ষেত্রে কোথায় অবস্থান, সেইটা মারাত্মকভাবে ম্যাটার করবে। তো আমার মনে হয় ন্যারেটিভস গুলোর মধ্যে একটা তফাৎ অবশ্যই উঠে আসবে, কিন্তু সেই কম্প্যারেটিভ স্টাডিটা, মানে এটা শুধু একটা বা দুটো ন্যারেটিভ পড়লে হবে না। একদিকে অনেক হিন্দু মহিলাদের লেখা এবং অপরদিকে মুসলিম মহিলাদের লেখাকে ফেলে তারপরে সেই কম্প্যারেটিভ স্টাডিটা করা যায় না। অবভিয়াসলি
আরেকটা কথা যেটা নন্দিতা বলছিলেন, সেটা হচ্ছে যে মেয়েদের লেখার মধ্যে কি ওই আবেগ বা মানে ওই যে মানে যন্ত্রণার যে অনুভূতি,
হ্যাঁ,
কি মানে বেশি মনে করো, মানে সেটা কি আরো স্ট্রং মনে করো মানে মুসলিম মেয়েদের সঙ্গে হিন্দু মেয়েদের লেখা, মুসলিম পুরুষদের লেখার সঙ্গে মুসলিম মেয়েদের লেখা, মানে সেটাও তুলনা করে পুরুষরা কিভাবে পার্টিশনকে দেখছে, মেয়েরা কি, মুসলিম মেয়েরা কিভাবে দেখছে, মানে সেটাও কিন্তু একটা দেখার মতো। মানে ওই ওই পুরুষরা কি অনেক র্যাশনালি ব্যাপারটাকে দেখছে, মানে যেটা ওই মেল র্যাশনালিটি এবং মানে ফিমেল ইমোশন, মানে ইমোশন ইজ ফেমিনাইন এবং র্যাশনালিটি ইজ ম্যাসকুলাইন, এবং তারই প্রকাশ করছে তাদের এই সব সেলফ মানে যে রেভেলেটরি ন্যারেটিভসে, মানে এরকম কি কিছু পাচ্ছো? মানে এই ধরনের যে স্টিরিওটাইপস গুলো প্যাট্রিয়ার্কি তৈরি করেছে, তো সেই স্টিরিওটাইপসেরই কি তুমি রিইনফোর্সমেন্ট পাচ্ছো
হ্যাঁ,
এদের
সেটা কিন্তু
সেলফ
অনেকটাই
ন্যারেটিভে?
রয়েছে। হ্যাঁ, অপর্ণাদি আপনি ঠিকই বলেছেন। যেরকম ধরুন আহ মহিলাদের লেখার ক্ষেত্রে যেটা আমরা দেখছি, রিলেশনাল আইডেন্টিটিস গুলো সেইটা কিন্তু অনেক বেশি গুরুত্ব পাচ্ছে। মা হিসাবে লিখছেন বা স্ত্রী হিসাবে লিখছেন, সন্তানকে হারানোর যে বেদনা বা স্বামীকে হারানোর বেদনা, পরিবারকে হারানোর বেদনা। সো সেখানে রিলেশনাল আইডেন্টিটিটা কিন্তু মূলত উঠে আসছে। কিন্তু এটাও ঠিক নয় যে সেখানে কোনো রকম পলিটিক্যাল ইন্টারভেনশন বা পলিটিক্যাল আন্ডারস্ট্যান্ডিং যে নেই, সেটাও কিন্তু ভুল কথা। তো আমার মনে হয়েছে যে এই টেনশন গুলো খুব সূক্ষ্মভাবে কাজ করছে উইমেন্স ন্যারেটিভস এর ক্ষেত্রে, যেখানে হয়তো মেন্স ন্যারেটিভসে আমরা হয়তো প্রধানত এটাই দেখছি যে পলিটিক্যাল ইনভলভমেন্ট, পলিটিক্যাল ডিসকোর্স সেটাই প্রাধান্য পাচ্ছে। সো এই সমস্ত ভীষণ ফাইন নুয়ান্সেস গুলো কিন্তু রয়েছে উইমেন্স ন্যারেটিভস এর ক্ষেত্রে।
আর ওই যে হোম, মানে আন্ডারস্ট্যান্ডিং অফ দ্য হোম, এটা
Yes.
এটা নিয়ে আমার নিজের একটা কৌতূহল রয়েছে। মেয়েরা হোম বলতে কি বোঝে, হ্যাঁ, আর ছেলেরাও কি বোঝে? মানে পার্টিশন মানেই তো অনেকের ওই ঘর ছাড়ার গল্প, মানে
হ্যাঁ,
আইদার এপার বাংলা থেকে ওপারে যাচ্ছে, ওপার বাংলা থেকে এখানে আসছে। তো ওই ঘর বলতে কি দেশ নাকি ওই গৃহ কোনটা? মানে মেয়েরা কি ঘর বলতে তার ওই ঘর সংসারটাকে বুঝছে না দেশ? মানে এই প্রশ্নগুলো আমার নিজের, মানে কিছু মেয়েদের লেখা পার্টিশন সংক্রান্ত আমি পড়েছি, মুসলিম
আচ্ছা।
মেয়েদের একেবারেই পড়িনি, কিন্তু আমার এই প্রশ্নগুলো মাথায় এসেছে। তুমি কি কিছু অবজার্ভ করেছো, মানে হাউ দে হ্যাভ ডিফাইন্ড দ্য হোম, মানে তাদের হোয়াট ইজ দেয়ার পারসেপশন অ্যাবাউট হোম, মানে হোম বলতে তারা কি বলছে? সেটা কি কিছু তুমি মানে কিছু মানে
From
খোঁজার
the
চেষ্টা করেছো?
from the narratives that I have been able to read, what I understood is that the home is surely, as you say, it is that familial space which a woman actually constructs, she builds. But again, the point is, due to the repeated displacements, the home is something that the woman carries with herself. So it is as much an emotional refuge, a recreation of that space in the imaginary as it is physical. So সেখানে ওই যে ইমোটিভ অ্যাসোসিয়েশনটা, দ্যাট ইজ ভেরি ভেরি স্ট্রং। It happens in the case of women mostly, আমি দেখছি, কারণ men's it is kind of that spatial occupation, spatial belonging, and that is also intrinsically related to power, that I belong, that is mine. So that has more of political associations, whereas in the case of women's writings, the home is something which women are often carrying with themselves. Yes, so even if they are on the other side of the border, it is the home which they have left behind that they are writing about. So which is very much
inter-religious romance marriage নিয়ে কি কোনো allusions তুমি মুসলিম womenদের লেখায় পেয়েছো?
That is mostly, I think, in the case of fiction, which I have not explored much. But personal narratives এর ক্ষেত্রে আমি খুব একটা সেভাবে পাইনি। সেটা হয়তো ফিকশনাল রাইটিং এ আমরা পেতে পারি।
ঠিক ঠিক, থ্যাংক ইউ।
চন্দন, আমি কি কিছু যোগ করতে পারি?
Yes, I have seen you have raised your hand.
না, যেহেতু তুমি বলছিলে that we have some time, আজকের আলোচনায় যেহেতু নন্দিতা দি এবং আফরোজাদি দুজনেই ইউনিফর্ম সিভিল কোডের যে জায়গাটা আনলেন এবং তাতে যেভাবে নন্দিতা দি এবং আফরোজাদি রেসপন্স করলেন, আমি যেহেতু আপনারা এটা নিয়ে ভাবছেন, আমি দু তিনটে জিনিস তার সঙ্গে ভাবছিলাম যে প্রাসঙ্গিক হতে পারে। একটা প্রবণতা কি দেখা যাচ্ছে যে যেহেতু ইউনিফর্ম সিভিল কোডের ধারণাটি প্রথমত তাত্ত্বিকভাবে, এটা বোধহয় অস্বীকার আপনারা কেউই করছেন না যে ইউনিফর্ম সিভিল কোডের ধারণা লিবারেল স্টেটের ধারণার সঙ্গে যায়, এবং নেহেরুর আমলেই ওটা হয়ে গেলে বোধহয় ভালো হতো। এবং যেহেতু কোনো ধর্মই নেই যে যারা নারীদের সমান অধিকার দেয়, ফলত ইউনিফর্ম সিভিল কোড খুব দরকার। আজকে আমরা তার বিরুদ্ধে যাচ্ছি, কেননা ওই ধারণাটিকে একটা বহু সংখ্যাগুরু বাদ ব্যবহার করছে। কিন্তু এইটা করতে গিয়ে আমরা কি কোনোভাবে মানে সংখ্যাগুরুবাদের হাতেই ওটা আবার প্রায় তুলে দিচ্ছি ধারণাটাকে? ঠিক যেমনটা আমি একটা উদাহরণ দিয়ে বলি যে একটা জিনিস তো সত্যি, আজকের ভারতের রাজনীতি আমাদের একটা জিনিস পরিষ্কার করে দিয়েছে যে ভারত পোস্ট নেহেরু ভারতীয় উদার মানবতাবাদী বুদ্ধিজীবীদের ভারতবর্ষ অ্যাকসেপ্ট করেনি। তারা এত বছর 40-50 দশক ধরে আমাদের যাবতীয় শিক্ষা প্রতিষ্ঠানের চূড়ায় থেকেও প্রতিটি শিক্ষানীতি নিয়ন্ত্রণ করার পরেও ভারতবর্ষের জনতা তা যে গ্রহণ করেনি বা তারা পৌঁছতে পারেননি, এটা তো একটা সত্যি কথা। সেটা মেনেই তো আমাদের পরবর্তী যাবতীয় ডিসকোর্স তৈরি হতে হবে। আমি তার বদলে যেটা দেখতে পাই বেশিরভাগ ক্ষেত্রে, সেটা হচ্ছে এক্ষুনি যে আক্রমণটা আসছে তার মুখোমুখি দাঁড়িয়ে তাৎক্ষণিক স্ট্র্যাটেজি তৈরির একটা প্রবণতা, যেটা খুব স্বাভাবিক। যিনি মাঠে নেমে লড়াই করছেন তিনি তা করবেন। কিন্তু এই জায়গাতেই আমরা যদি অ্যান্টি সিএ মুভমেন্টটাকে দেখি, তাহলে আমরা দেখবো যে কিভাবে মুসলিম নারীরা স্বাধীনতা, দেশ, দেশপ্রেম, বন্দে মাতরম এইগুলোকে রেটরিক্যাল স্ট্র্যাটেজি হিসেবে নিজেরা নিয়ে নিয়েছেন, যেটা আমার মনে হয়েছে যে এই ভারতবর্ষের এই অবস্থায় স্ট্র্যাটেজিক্যালি খুব গুরুত্বপূর্ণ এবং খুব ভালো একটি অবস্থান ছিল। তো আমি যেটা বলতে চাইছি যে ইউনিফর্ম সিভিল কোড তা নিয়ে আমরা যে বিরোধিতাটা করব, তার পাশাপাশি ইউনিফর্ম সিভিল কোড আদর্শ কি হতে পারে তার একটা ন্যারেটিভ যদি চালু না রাখি, তাহলে বোধহয় আমরা এই লড়াইটাতে শেষ অবধি এমন একটা দলকে সুবিধে করে দেব যারা ওই ধর্মীয় পরিচিতির ভিত্তিতে আমাদের আটকে রাখার চেষ্টা করছে। সংখ্যাগুরুর ধর্মীয় পরিচিতির ভিত্তিতে রাষ্ট্রকে দখল করার বিরোধিতা করতে গিয়ে আমরা না আবার অন্যান্য ধর্মীয় গোষ্ঠীগুলোর হাতে আমাদেরকে আরো অনেকটা ছেড়ে দিই। তাই সম্ভবত এটা বিকল্প ইউনিফর্ম সিভিল কোডের ধারণা নিয়ে ডিসকোর্স চালিয়ে যাওয়া উচিত।
নিশ্চয়ই
আমার যা মনে হলো সেটাই বললাম। আপনারা যেহেতু
আমি আপনার সঙ্গে সহমত।
হ্যাঁ হ্যাঁ না অপর্ণা বলো। আমি
না তুমি বলো।
একটু সময় আছে বলে ভাবলাম, মানে খুবই ইম্পর্টেন্ট পয়েন্ট তুলেছেন আপনি অমিতাভ। আমার মনে হয় যে এটা একেবারেই ঠিক। আপনি যে কথাটা বললেন যে যেইভাবে মুসলিম নারীরা নিজেদের কমিউনিটির মধ্যে থেকে বেরিয়ে এসে যেই আমরা এম্পাওয়ারিং যেই জায়গাটা দেখতে পাচ্ছি, যেখানে অতটা এজেন্সি দেখতে পাচ্ছি, এই কথাটা কিন্তু নারীবাদীরা 1990s থেকেও বলছেন, যেখানে নানান রকম মুসলিম মহিলারা কিন্তু মুসলিম নারীবাদীরাও সেখানে ছিলেন, যেখানে একটা দাবি উঠে এসেছিল যে ইউনিফর্ম সিভিল কোডটাকে ওইভাবে স্টেট থেকে লাগু না করে কমিউনিটিজের ভেতর থেকে এক ধরনের প্রচেষ্টা করা হোক। ইনফ্যাক্ট আপনি যে লিবারেলসদের কথা বলছেন, তখন তো সত্যি কংগ্রেস, বিজেপি এরা সবাই তো সাপোর্ট করেছিল ইউনিফর্ম সিভিল কোড, এবং ইভেন নারীবাদীদের মধ্যে দেওয়া যে লিবারেল গ্রুপ আমি বলবো যারা সাপোর্ট করছিল, অন্যরা আবার বলছিল যে উইদিন দ্য কমিউনিটিজ এই জায়গাটাকে তুলে ধরা হোক। এবং এটা নিয়ে নানান ডিবেটস আছে, যেটা অপর্ণাও বলছিলেন, মানে আমরা সবাই আমরা পরবর্তীকালে একবার এই ডিবেটস আবার ফিরে যাওয়া আমাদের উচিত। সো এইটা নয় যে এটা হিন্দু রাইট গভর্নমেন্টে আসার পরেই ডিবেটস গুলো হয়েছে, ডিবেটস গুলো তার আগে থেকেই হয়েছে, বিকজ এটা নিয়ে অনেক কাজ অলরেডি, স্কলারশিপ অলরেডি রয়েছে। তো আমার যেটা মনে হয় যে যেহেতু মানে রিফর্ম ফ্রম উইদিন ব্যাপারটা এসেছিল, একটা সেগমেন্ট বলছিল যে রিফর্মটা উইদিন দ্য কমিউনিটিস থেকে আসা উচিত, যেখানে তাহলে যারা সো কল্ড মাইনরিটি কমিউনিটিস তাদের একটা সে থাকবে, এবং যে মেজরিটেরিয়ান ভিউ পয়েন্ট থেকে শুধু ফর দ্য নেশন বলে তাদের উপর কিছু চাপানো হবে না। আরেকটা দলের মন্তব্য ছিল যে ইউনিফর্ম সিভিল কোডের দ্বারা আমরা যেই ধরনের আইন মানে তাকে ইউনিফর্ম করার চেষ্টা করছি, সেটা না করে ওই যেরকম ভাবে সিভিল লজ, ক্রিমিনাল লজ হচ্ছে, সেখানে ছোট ছোট করে আইনগুলোকে অন্যভাবে যদি ভাবা হয়। সো এই নিয়ে নানান রকম মতামত রয়েছে। সো এমন নয় যে ইট ইজ নাম্বার ওয়ান যে এখন এসছে এই ডিবেটস গুলো, আর এটাও নয় যে খুব একটা ইউনিফর্ম ডিবেটসও আছেন, এর মধ্যে নানান রকম পসিবিলিটিস এর আলোচনা কিন্তু বারবার করে আমরা কিন্তু করে এসেছি। সো আমার মনে হয় আপনি যেটা বললেন একেবারেই ইউনিফর্ম প্রবলেমটা আসলে এখন যেটা হয়ে যাচ্ছে, এখানে হয়তো ইউনিফর্ম সিভিল কোড আমরা এইভাবে দেখছি, সেই জন্য আমার মনে হচ্ছিল যে ইন্ডিয়া আর বাংলাদেশ দুটোকে লার্জার স্তরে রেখে যদি আমরা আরেকবার এই ডিসকোর্সটাতে ঢুকতে পারি, এবং সেইখানে সত্যিই তো ইউনিফর্ম সিভিল কোড যখন ভাবা হয়েছিল জেন্ডার জাস্টিসটা আদৌ আমরা সেন্টার পয়েন্ট রাখছি কিনা, দ্যাট বিকামস ওয়ান অফ দ্য মেজর লেন্স থ্রু উইচ আই থিঙ্ক উই শুড রিভিজিট দ্য ইউনিফর্ম সিভিল কোড। এখন যেটা হয়ে যাচ্ছে কি, মানে জেন্ডার জাস্টিসের নামে নানান কিছু হচ্ছে, যেটা আমাদের পক্ষে দুপক্ষেই ভীষণ একটা ডেঞ্জারাস, মানে আইদার অরই ভীষণ গন্ডগোল হয়েছে। মহিলারা যেন বাদ পড়ে যাচ্ছে তখন, আর মুসলিম মহিলারা তাহলে আরো বেশি বাদ পড়ে যাবে। এবং এই সব এই নানান রকম কথা আমারও আপনার কথা শুনে বারবার মনে হচ্ছে। থ্যাংক ইউ।
ঠিক।
Okay, so I think now we have come to the end part of our session. But before that, I would definitely like to thank again Dr. Saptaparna Roy and Dr. Aparna Bandyopadhyay for their very, very thought-provoking lectures. They have presented their discourses and arguments so eloquently, and that is also followed by a very, very insightful and interactive Q&A session that I have checked, and I have seen that the number of the participants augmented very slowly because it is also running on YouTube. So many have joined there, I suppose. And finally, I would like to thank International Society of Bengal Studies for organizing such a wonderful and, in my opinion, much needed, much required webinar with the help of, this is also very interesting and important to mention, that with the help of 3 most eminent esteemed universities. Now I have nothing more to say. Now I just request Madam Nandita Dhawan to conclude this session.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Bandyopadhyay, Dr. Roy, and Dr. Adhya for making this wonderful session possible. এবং আমার মনে হয় যে সেশনের সাকসেসটা বোঝা যায় যখন তারপরে ডিসকাশনস গুলো হয়, এবং যেটা ডক্টর আদহ্য অলরেডি বললেন যে এত আলোচনা যে হলো তারপরে, সেটাই স্পিকার্সদেরকে ভীষণভাবে কংগ্রাচুলেট করার জন্য it is the proof to that. So I thank you again from the part of the organizers. আমরা সবাই I'm sure এই ডিসকাশনস অনেক বেশি লাভবান হব, আরো অনেক বেশি আমাদের this is food for our thought, and we should continue to this interaction in the near future as well. Thank you so much. আমি তাহলে এই সেশনটা এখানেই শেষ করছি। আমাদের নেক্সট সেশনটা if I'm not mistaken 2টো থেকে, আমরা 2টোর সময়